All right, welcome Year 12 to this video on The Glass Jar by Gwen Harwood. Like when we did the violets, please make sure that you have your poetry booklet with you. As I discuss the poem, you should be marking up your copy with annotations that you understand. So like the violets, this is a highly kind of dense and symbolic poem. I'm presenting one interpretation, but feel free to disagree with me and make sure that you discuss that with your teacher and your peers. Okay, so let's start with the main ideas and style. So Glass Jar is actually an earlier poem than the Violets. So this poem is from the collection Poems published in 1963. But it explores some of the same ideas as the Violets, which is why we're looking at them kind of together. So similarly, this poem is about childhood and maturation, but in The Glass Jar, the focus is on growing up as a kind of traumatic experience and one characterized by uncertainty. Growing up is about a growing awareness of the complexities of adulthood, particularly adult relationships and sexuality. Within the poem, there's a transformation of childhood innocence and faith and worldview through a confrontation with the adult world. The Violets had this idea of kind of oppositional concepts, and the Glass Jar similarly explores paradoxes. So, for example, in the Glass Jar, childhood innocence and a limited understanding, which we would usually think of as a good thing, actually creates fear and anxiety. And growing up is characterized as about what is lost and what is gained. So, style and form. This is a narrative lyric poem, which means that it is a narrative. It's telling a story about a child and their experiences, but it's highly lyrical and symbolic. There are 7 stanzas and they are organized in sestets, which are 6-line stanzas, and they follow the course of a night from evening to dawn. So those temporal markers here are going to be just as important as when we saw them in the Violets. Similarly to the Violets, we've got a cyclical structure. The Violets started and ended with the Violets, and this poem starts and ends with a glass jar. Okay, so organized around this central motif. It's primarily an iambic tetrameter, which is a particular pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. Don't worry too much about that, but it is interesting to note that this does have kind of a structure. It's not free verse like the Violets. It also has a consistent rhyme pattern of A, B, B, A, C, C. And it is highly religious in its imagery and symbolism. So on a first reading, if you're not kind of familiar with a lot of Catholic practices, you probably missed some of the religious imagery, but hopefully by the end of this lesson, we'll be more confident with that. Okay, the title, The Glass Jar. So like the Violets, this poem has a highly symbolic title, but I don't think it's all that clear what the glass jar specifically symbolizes. I think there's lots of different options. I'm going to suggest a few things, and you might come to your own conclusion. So if we think about glass, glass is fragile, but it's also transparent, okay? So there's something there about vulnerability and fragility, I think. A jar is a container, and in the poem, it's used by the persona to try and capture light. Now, light might symbolize faith or innocence, and so the glass jar maybe symbolizes the desire to capture and maintain innocence or faith. And our question throughout the poem is that possible? Okay, So like when we did the violets, I'm going to read out these stanzas first, and then I'm going to point out some of what I think are the important language features for us to consider when we're deciphering the meaning of this poem. So this poem is dedicated to Vivian Smith. Now, Vivian Smith is an Australian poet and a contemporary of Harwood, and also was her close friend. It was a pretty common practice for Harwood to dedicate her poetry to her friends or colleagues or family. Now, from my reading, I couldn't find anything that suggested that this poem was autobiographical to Vivian Smith or reflected his experiences in any way. So I don't think that the dedication actually plays much bearing on our interpretation of the poem, but it's interesting to note, and maybe you'll find other information, but I couldn't find anything that would suggest that that's particularly important. All right, so the poem. A child one summer's evening soaked a glass jar in the reeling sun, hoping to keep when day was done, and all the sun's disciples cloaked in dream and darkness. From his passion fled this host, this pulse of light beside his bed. Wrapped in a scarf, his monstrance stood, ready to bless, to exorcise monsters that whispering would rise nightly from the intricate wood that ringed his bed, to light with total power the holy commonplace of field and flower. He slept. His sidelong violence summoned fiends whose mosaic vision saw his heart entire. Pincer and claw, trident and vampire fang, envenomed with his most secret hate, reached and came near to pierce him in the thicket of his fear. Okay, so first thing I want to point out is that we start with this indefinite noun of a child, okay? This is an anonymous child. We don't know who it is. It's not personalized, okay, which I think clearly universalizes the experience. Like in the violets, this is about childhood generally rather than the childhood of a particular person. So we have a child who is soaking a glass jar in the sun, okay? So who's trying to capture sunlight in a jar because they believe it will protect them, okay? So in the opening stanza, we have a lot of juxtaposition between light and dark. Summers, sun, darkness, the pulse of light, okay? And that introduces this central tension between good and evil, innocence and knowledge and uncertainty, which the poem is going to explore. Look at the verb and the hopeful language that is used to describe the way the child is acting. So the child doesn't just kind of open up the glass jar, hold it up to the sun, and then close it. It says that he soaks the glass jar in the sun because he's hoping to keep the sun's rays. And I think that really reflects the child's naive and childlike faith that they believe they can capture the sun and its power in a jar. The next thing I want you to note is all of the religious imagery that is in these opening stanzas. Okay, so I'm going to go through some of it now. So firstly, we have the sun's disciples. So there is a play on words here, or a pun on the word sun, which obviously means the literal sun, but also refers to the Son as in Jesus Christ. Okay. How do we know that's what it means? Because it talks about the Son's disciples. Okay. So it's a reference to Jesus's disciples. So what's happening here is that the child is imagining this sunset that he's seeing in the evening, and it's being transformed into an image of Jesus and his disciples. Okay. So I think the purpose of that is it's establishing that this is a child who sees the world through a religious lens or a religious worldview, and it's particularly a Catholic worldview. We know that because of the reference to the host and the monstrance. So in Catholic practice, when they have communion or the Eucharist, The bread, which is representative of Christ's body, is called the host. Okay. And this is, it represents Christ's body, but in Catholic practice, it's thought to possess really a particular power and be the very presence of God. So this is a very powerful, very spiritual object. And in the Catholic Church, the host was stored in the monstrance, okay, which was a sacred vessel that was used to store the host so that people could sit and pray in front of the host, okay? So for the child, they're creating their own host and monstrance by the glass jar, okay? And that's the kind of power they believe the glass jar is going to have. Why do they need the glass jar? The child needs the glass jar because he knows he's going to have these nightmares at night, okay? And that's what we get to in the second stanza. So before we get to the nightmares, let's just think about the other language that's used to kind of communicate the child's faith in the jar of light. So we see the tricolon that the jar is going to be able to bless, to exercise, and to light. We see the hyperbole that he believes the glass jar is going to have total power. And we also see that short sentence, he slept, which I think again emphasizes the child's faith in religion, in the glass jar, which is representing religion here, to protect him and allow him the peace to sleep. Juxtaposing all of the religious imagery is then the Gothic imagery, okay? The monsters, that whispering, the intricate wood of the bed. So his bedroom is being transformed into kind of this Gothic sort of nightmare with monsters that can whisper to him and whispering, I think, threats of evil. I think it's also interesting to note the high modality language here. The whispering monsters would rise, okay? It's not like an option of something that might happen. The child knows this is going to happen, and that's why they've pre-prepared this kind of object they think will protect them. And then we get in the third stanza this image of the nightmare, okay? What can we say about this? Okay, so let's first think about the Gothic imagery continued. So we have the description of these monsters as being pincer and claw, trident and vampire fang. So here we've got an example of synecdoche, okay, where the monsters are just referred to as parts of their body, like a pincer and a claw. And to me, that really intensifies the intensity of the child's nightmare, okay? It's like they can't quite see the whole thing, but you see a pincer or there you see a fang, and that makes it more frightening, right? Let's think about the child's perspective of these monsters, and this is really interesting, okay? So he thinks, or in his mind, the monsters see his heart, okay? So they are envenomed, so they're made powerful with his most secret hate, okay? So there's a sense here that the monsters are coming from something within the child, within his heart, okay? Because they saw his heart entire, and they're envenomed with his most secret hate, okay? Which is an example of personification. So the monsters get their power from something within the child, his fear, his anxiety, maybe. And from the verb choice of pierce, we get a sense that they're going to damage him in some way. So I don't think it's entirely clear here, you know, what the monsters are or in what sense they come from within the child. But again, this is something that you might want to discuss with your class. Okay, next two stanzas. So he's had the nightmare and then he woke recalled his jar of light, and trembling reached one hand to grope the mantling scarf away. Then hope fell headlong from its eagle height. Through the dark house he ran, sobbing his loss, to the last clearing that he dared not cross. The bedroom, where his comforter lay in his rival's fast embrace. The faithless would not turn her face from the gross violence done to her. Love's proud executants played from a score no child could read or realize once more. All right, so we continue to have a juxtaposition between light and dark. So the jar of light, the dark house, okay, childhood innocence, the darkness of the world. And then we have this imagery of the child's hope or faith kind of coming crashing down, because he realizes when he takes the scarf away from the jar that the light is no longer there. Okay, he wasn't able to capture the light. And so his hope fell headlong from its eagle height. Look at the kind of collection of language techniques that are used to emphasize that line. We have the personification of hope falling. We have the symbolism of eagles, okay, so something really high and an image of freedom kind of falling away. And then we have the alliteration on her, okay, the hope headlong height, which really emphasizes this line. And they combine to emphasize the force with which this child's faith is kind of collapsing. So he runs through the house and he gets to the bedroom door of his parents, okay? The clearing, that's how it's described. So the clearing is symbolic of the parents' bedroom door, which is a boundary line between childhood innocence and adult understanding, okay? Because when he opens the door, he's going to be confronted with his parents being intimate, and that is an action that he can't understand as a child. So he describes it in these really strange ways, okay? So he sees his parents being intimate, and he says his comforter, which is his mother, lay in his rival's fast embrace. So this is an allusion to the Oedipal complex. You can go and look that up if you don't know what that is, but he's not understanding what's happening. He describes the mother as faithless, okay, which is, I think, really dehumanizing to the mother, okay? This is, and it also it relates her to religion, okay? It's religious, faithless, religious word. So this reflects a changing relationship with his mother, okay? She's no longer a source of comfort to him, okay? And their relationship is evolving, okay? The loss of faith in his parents is paralleling a loss of faith in religion. Remember, this is symbolic, right? So as he enters the bedroom, this is about the child entering adulthood. As he enters adulthood, his relationship with his parents changes and his relationship with faith changes. Irony that sexual intimacy is misread by the child as violence, okay? So again, reflecting a lack of understanding. And that is emphasized again with this metaphor that love's proud exultants played from a score no child could read or realize. So when we're talking about a score here, we're talking about a musical notation, okay? So the metaphor is suggesting that, like a child couldn't read music, this child can't read what's happening within his parents' bedroom. And then we'll go to the next slide because there's the enjambment here. So we start with once more to bed, and to worse dreams he went. A ring of skeletons compelled his step with theirs. His father held fiddle and bow and scraped a scent to the malignant ballet. The child dreamed this dance perpetual, and waking screamed, fresh morning to his windowsill. As ravening birds began their song, the resurrected sun, whose long triumph through flower-brushed fields would fill night's gulfs and hungers, came to wink and laugh, in a glass jar beside a crumpled scarf. Okay, so there's a enjambment between this stanza and the previous one. So it says once more to bed. So the line continues across the stanzas, and that really carries you through the story. So the reader goes straight into the next stanza, and that's sort of mirroring the child's inability to escape what they've just seen, I think. He can't escape. He goes to bed, and now, this was all about escaping his nightmares, and now he's just got a worse nightmare, okay? So the comparative adjective worse here suggests that the real life adult world that he's just been exposed to is more frightening for him than the monsters from the initial nightmare, okay? It's adulthood that is the ultimate nightmare for the child. So he has this another horrible dream, this poor child. And this is this dream of these skeletons. And his father is one of the skeletons who's playing like some kind of fiddle or violin. And the skeletons are dancing a ballet, okay? So this is an allusion to the danse macabre, okay? Which is, I've put a little image of it on the slides. But the dance macabre is called the dance of death, is this medieval kind of idea or artistic motif that shows up in medieval paintings, in which death is depicted as a skeleton leading people who are also depicted as skeletons in a kind of dance towards the grave. And the general interpretation of this motif was that the message was that death is kind of universal and inescapable, okay? So what would the purpose be of this illusion, okay? Well, in the child's imagination, that he imagines that his father is death, okay? And so what's happening is it's suggesting that the child's encounter that he's just had with the adult world has shattered his innocence and given him a new awareness of mortality, okay? So being thrust into the adult world means for the child an awareness of death and time passing, okay? So we get an allusion back to, or a reference back to similar ideas to the violence, okay? But again, adulthood is for the child associated with death, okay? The child dreamed this dance perpetual and waking screamed, okay? So the verb choice of screamed there indicates that this introduction to the adult world is completely overwhelming emotionally to the child and traumatic, right? But then we get this tonal shift, okay? And that annotation is in the wrong color. That should be in that yellow color. So we get all of these words in the last stanza that relate to morning and light. So fresh morning, we've got birds singing, songs, flower-brushed fields. So all of these words related to nature and life, okay? So hope returns with morning, okay? But it's interesting here that the birds are described as ravening, okay? So the word ravening means kind of like hungry and greedy. So I think that suggests that even as kind of morning comes and hope returns for the child, there is reminders of death and danger, okay? Particularly consumption and hunger, which we'll see that night is associated with later. So we got, again, the religious imagery and the pun returning. So the resurrected sun is back. The child's faith is back, maybe. And the sun has long triumph over night's gulps and hungers. So the stanza does say, this final stanza does say that the sun will triumph over the night, okay? Hope will triumph over darkness, that kind of thing. But I want you to think about whether you think this is a hopeful ending to the poem or not, okay? Some things that I've read have suggested that this is kind of like a really hopeful ending, okay? Like this idea that childhood faith and innocence kind of will remain or continue. I'm not entirely convinced by that reading for a couple of reasons. So particularly the last couple of lines. So it says that the sun came to wink and laugh in a glass jar beside a crumpled scarf. There's a few things here, okay? So obviously the glass jar coming back and being filled with light does seem to symbolize some kind of return of faith, okay, for the child. But it's beside a crumpled scarf, okay? I think that word crumpled is doing a lot of work here. I guess our question is, has the child's faith been transformed or just damaged, like a crumpled scarf? That's up to you to decide. The next thing you have to kind of decide in order to interpret this poem is what's happening with the winking and laughing sun, okay? So obviously if you wink and laugh at someone, that could be like a positive thing. You could be like being all like chummy with them. But there's also a sense that this could be a mocking action. So is the sun mocking the child? If the sun is mocking the child, then faith is mocking the child, if we see sun as being symbolic of faith. And then maybe it's suggesting that the child's faith is kind of empty as they move into adulthood. Again, this is about your interpretation. I think that there is ways to read the ending of this poem in a positive way or in a more negative way. And maybe that's something that you guys can discuss with your teachers and your peers. So I will end the video there, and I will see you in the next video.